Staying on a tax discussion topic track late in the afternoon, trying to keep you guys awake and invigorated, we thought we'd jump to property tax. In Montana, as you've seen from this last presentation, we now are the beneficiaries of a very complicated tax structure. And it started to frustrate businesses by rising property taxes. Residential property taxes have seen substantial increases over the last few years, driven by the surge in new home purchases and new residents, full-time and part-time residents to the state. As that tension is continuing to grow, and we had a session last night, it became abundantly clear that it may not get better before it gets, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And the chamber has taken a strong position that we are trying to advocate for thoughtful, intentional tax reform that provides relief across all Montanans. So our next panel is going to spend a little bit of time talking about the impacts of that recently passed property tax legislation. We have Sarah Clairgett, of Council and Government Affairs Director at Holland & Hart, the Director of MDU Resources Corporate Strategy, Paul Hopfoff, and the Executive Director of the Montana Taxpayers Association, Bob Story, are going to also join our President and CEO of the Montana Chamber, Todd O'Hare, to try to help us unpack really what the impact of this is and where do we go from here.
Well, in case you haven't had enough of a dose around taxes, we're going to dive into it a little bit more. And this was an issue that when we rolled into the 2025 session, it was the dominant issue. I mean, this was the issue that sucked the oxygen out of the room. And the ramifications of it are still being felt and understood. And so we're going to dive into this a little bit, primarily from a business perspective. And what does this mean? Because we all know that given Montana's tax structure, the only way that we can provide property tax relief to one class of property taxpayers is we got to raise it on another one. That's the only way that we can provide property tax relief. And so that's what we saw during this legislative session, is that there weren't solutions for property taxes, there was a shift. And there was a pretty big shift that took place, and it took place onto businesses, and it took place onto some of our larger employers. And ironically, it also shifted burden onto natural resource companies. So we're going to kind of talk about this a little bit, and Bob Story is probably the preeminent expert on taxes in Montana. And you got a little bit of a primer on some of the shifts that took place from the last panel. But Bob, I think a good place for you to start is like this disparity that is being borne by businesses versus residential now. Like this shift has been happening for a number of years, but we've really seen it. So talk a little bit about what you've seen in the shift that we've seen and the disparity and what business is paying compared to what residential properties are paying.
Well, thanks, Todd, and thank you and the Chamber for having us come and speak. And I want to also say that the Taxpayers Association and the Chamber have worked together on a lot of issues for a lot of time, and we really appreciate the support that the Chamber provided that. You've all got a program in front of you, and if you look at page 37 in that particular program, there's a couple of graphs there that kind of illustrate what's happened in the last 2 years, just the last couple of years with the change in the tax policy. As you may or may not know, Montana has a fairly complicated property classification system, 16 classes of property and a lot of different tax rates or apportionment factors there. And so not everybody, every type of property pays the same taxes per dollar of value. And that's what these graphs show you. If you look on the graphs there, the small column on the left is residential property, and this just shows you the dollars they pay if you had $500,000 worth of property in a taxing jurisdiction that was about 500 mills. And so that's residential. The next one over is commercial, and you'll see the commercial property, because they have a higher tax rate, residential is about 0.76 up, as was explained by the guys just before me. commercial tax rates are 1.5% to 1.9%. And then if you get over to the third column, that's electrical generation and telecom, their tax rate is 6%. And the centrally assessed guys, the pipelines and electrical distribution, are the high column on the right. Those are 12%. So you can see if you had a $500,000 worth of residential property, your taxes are around $2,000. If you have $500,000 worth of centrally assessed property, your taxes are around $30,000. So that's the disparity that has been built into the system over the last 30 years, and that's the problem that we face of going forward. Every time a mill levy goes up, those proportional increases happen. Business used to be on par with residential. Now it's anywhere from 2.5 times to 16 times residential. So, those are the things that we have to overcome going down the road.
And Sarah, you're with Holland and Hart, and undeniably Holland and Hart is one of the premier law firms in Montana and in the country. Very well respected. And you represent a lot of clients that are business clients. Some of them are very large, some of them are small. This property tax issue that we have here in Montana, this is not new. This is not just a result of what happened in 2025. I try to tell folks that this property tax issue that we have in Montana has been building for a number of years. Business has been hollering about property tax rates for a very long time. They really came to a head. So talk to us about what you're hearing from your clients, both pre-2025 and the laws that changed, and then what you're hearing subsequent to that. Because there's a picture that's to be painted here, and this is not the most attractive state as far as property taxes are concerned.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's right. There has definitely been a long history of property taxes being one of, if not the highest operating costs for a lot of businesses in Montana. And that, coupled with the uncertainty, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about later, creates a problem both for existing businesses and for investment in Montana. And so one of the things we've heard kind of over the course of time is that as these operating costs increase, then either you're looking at businesses who are actually going to pick up and move to states that are more competitive, or you're looking at investments that are going to go to other states as opposed to Montana. And so one of the things that factors into that we saw is the uncertainty and the fact that it's very hard for investors and companies to predict what their costs are going to be over time, which makes it difficult to manage your operating costs. Additionally, we've seen just our clients generally have increased their tax appeals over the last cycle. And this is something I'll talk a little bit more too about later. It's something that a lot of businesses don't really think about in Montana, but we actually have a pretty good system of informal tax appeals at the county level and then at the state level. And it can really reduce your taxable value in a relatively easy and short timeline. And so we've seen a huge amount of those, which again isn't overall going to affect your costs doing something like an appeal, but it does add to your costs. You're going to have to pay somebody like me or somebody else to come along and argue about your taxable value of your property. Now, I do think the bang for the buck is going to be probably pretty good on that. But it does add some level of uncertainty to your cost analysis over time. Another thing that we've talked about a lot is the energy costs. You're going to hear a lot about that. And you're going to hear some about some of the pass-through costs, but another piece of that there is energy when you talk about operating costs, in addition to taxes, energy is another one of the huge costs, largest operating costs for a number of our clients, refineries, industry, natural resources. And when you're looking at the cost of energy, right, it's not just the cost on your utility bill, because a lot of the large customers in Montana, they don't have to go through the Northwestern Energy or MDU here. They can do choice And so the problem is, though, that the energy is still very expensive. And so you're trying to attract generation and infrastructure transmission to Montana, and it's very difficult to do that with both the uncertainty and with the high property taxes. And so the cost of energy is being both directly and indirectly affected by the property taxes. So we're talking about that too a lot in the energy task force that I'm on.
And so,
Nope, you're off, I think.
So Bob, when I think about like this story about how property taxes have been a problem in the business community for a very long time, one of the things that I've heard you talk about is that, well, how do you think we got 16 classes of property taxes, right? There's been a long period of time where businesses have like tried to carve out different rates from the regular property tax system. And we've got a really convoluted system now. And then you combine the fact that you've got 16 classes, then you've got all sorts of exemptions that the legislature will pass, and the Montana Chamber has largely supported those sort of exemptions, right? 6-year, 9-year sort of exemptions in order to attract a business into the state. Talk about kind of what you've seen in that. I mean, you served in the legislature as president of the Senate a number of years, and so you've seen this building for a long time, and you see the philosophy that's playing out directly related to the fact that we've got a property tax problem in the state, and the legislature continues to try to cobble something together.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Todd. I started in the legislature in 1995, and at that time we had about 11 classes of property. Then in 1999, because of deregulation, both in the telecom industry and in the electrical industry coming on, we created another class of property because we reduced the tax rate on electrical generation and telecom from 12% down to 6% to make them more competitive. So then we created Class 13 property. Then in 2005, wind energy came on and they needed a break, so they didn't want to be at 6% with everybody else in the generation, so we created a Class 14, a wind energy at 3%. And that just kept snowballing. So then pretty soon you got another class of property for carbon dioxide pipelines. They didn't want to pay 12%. They couldn't work at that, so they were at 3%. And you got another class for data centers. You got another class for green hydrogen. Everybody that came in wanted a different, lower tax rate to come into Montana and compete. So that's how we got all the different classes. And then on top of that, then you get various laws that say, well, if you build this type of property, local government will have to abate your taxes for 5 years, and then you phase up. So by 10 years, you're up to full value. Even though you may be competing, you get somebody that's paying full taxes. So we have those things working. I mean, all these abatement programs are just another indication that our current system's broken, and you have to put special provisions in to get business development.
Yeah, and I think, Paul, when we think about Montana's place in a competitive environment, right? We've always tried to make Montana competitive. Dollars will flow to where there is the least resistance. And MDU operates in multiple states, one of which notably is North Dakota. Talk to us about how you see Montana's tax structure and how it kind of fits in this sort of competitive nature of where Montana sits adjacent to states like North Dakota and Wyoming and some of these other states.
No, that's great. Thanks, Todd. I think this is an important topic. When property taxes come up, typically it's so centered on residential that the business story gets lost. So I really appreciate this opportunity. And your point about being competitive is really key. And before I begin, I'll say Montana's done some really great things in the last 5-6 years to be more competitive with our neighboring states. And that's been very successful and very helpful to our business community. The big remaining issue, probably the biggest competitive stumbling block and why we're here today, is talking about property taxes. So my comments are really going to be about our interstate pipeline company, which is essentially assessed property, as Bob mentioned just a minute ago. That property spans 5 states: Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming. And unbeknownst to most people in Montana, we actually own and operate North America's largest underground natural gas storage facility by working gas capacity around Baker, Montana and eastern Montana. So I'm going to start with the Bakken. You all know Bakken is this prolific oil and gas play. What's really important to think about the Bakken is it's an oil play. So at the end of the day, oil must move. There's a lot of associated natural gas, and that has to get out of the way of the oil. It has to move, and it'll move at any price point to ensure that nothing impedes oil production. So that's resulted in North Dakota and the Bakken producing some of the most competitive natural gas priced in North America. A project that we're looking at is a large diameter, 350-mile pipeline going from the Bakken across the center of the state to Fargo. Pipelines get built based on firm subscribers, people that are willing to pay for that capacity. We're going to find out as those non-binding commitments become firm here shortly, and that'll determine the diameter of the pipe. But at the end of the day, that's going to create this industrial corridor through the center of the state from the west to east of North Dakota. And I'll get to the Montana piece here quick. For business expansion and more notably business attraction. So one of the things, knowing that Montana really could benefit from large quantities of super competitive priced natural gas, we thought, well, let's take a look at a Montana project. So just to create apples to apples, we just picked $1 billion, and you don't get as much pipe for $1 billion as you'd think, but let's just pick a number. $1 billion project in North Dakota compared to $1 billion project in Montana. So if we just isolate property taxes, comparing those two projects against each other, due to the centrally assessed property tax rate in Montana, we would have to charge Montana customers 19% more than similarly situated customers in North Dakota, 19%. And that's based on the 24 taxes. We all know that that's, because of the shift, that's going to be higher. But let's just pick on 19% for now. So why is that? In Montana, we pay 10 times the rate that we pay in North Dakota. So that's really where that comes from. So to put that in a visual perspective, and I had a graph, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to use it, but I'll talk through it. So just put it in perspective, a little over 50% of our interstate pipelines, property, plant, and equipment is invested in North Dakota. That 50% of our investment contributes to about, let's call it 15% of our total property tax bill across that company. In Montana, we've got 30% of our assets located within this state. 80%, roughly, of our total property tax bill is Montana property taxes. So that's just a visual comparison of why that rate would be higher for Montana customers, and it really creates this competitive disadvantage. And more to the point is this tax shift. So when we go to the customer and say, we're going to sign a 20-year commitment for that customer for service, in North Dakota, that would be a fixed number, say 30 cents, 40 cents, whatever the number is. In Montana, you've got to not only bake in the property tax differential, but what might those taxes be because of tax shifts over the next 50 years? This is centrally assessed property that has very long lives, 40, 50 plus years. So that directly impacts capital allocation decisions that companies have that operate in multiple states where they place that capital.
Yeah. When we think about, the big talk is data centers, right? Oh my gosh, we're going to see a big growth in data centers. The one thing that comes with data centers is energy consumption, right? These are really large electrical consumers. And you think about the competitive position of Montana versus the competitive position of North Dakota, using this one industry as an example, where you got cheap natural gas, low property taxes versus Montana. It's kind of like we're at a bit of a disadvantage here.
Yeah, it's tough to compete. The numbers for, it goes beyond data centers, just there's billions and billions of dollars of projects being queued in discussion and in development in North Dakota. And I think that it's really incumbent on Montana to remove this competitive barrier to compete for those dollars.
Sarah?
Well, I was just going to add that, again, going back to that uncertainty piece too, is where if you're trying to plan capital investment, you're trying to, we're looking at, we have several clients who are data centers and are looking at investing in Montana. And one of the things that the investors are really nervous about is that uncertainty, right? And if there's a bunch of uncertainty that we can't help. There's public opinion that sometimes you're running up against. There's a lot of regulatory, permitting uncertainty, litigation. But one of the things that they also have to factor in is the property tax uncertainty. And with an already uncertain climate, some of those investors are really running for the hills. And anywhere we can reduce that uncertainty, if it's in energy costs or if it's in property tax costs, is a real opportunity to attract in Montana.
So, Paul, you and I, we chatted about this earlier, about, there is the pass-through cost of property tax with like a utility. It's a different sort of process when you have to go to your regulators to get pass-through costs for a pipeline. Like in Montana, right? I mean, Northwestern Energy sees a big property tax increase, it's passed on to the customers. A pipeline is a little different story. Tell us what's the differences there.
Yeah, so we operate five electric natural gas utilities from Minnesota to Washington, Oregon. And with electric and natural gas utilities, there's pass-through mechanisms for property taxes and property tax increases. The challenge with interstate pipelines is that you cover multiple states, but you're regulated by one regulator, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So there's not mechanisms just to go in for recovery on just the Montana piece, those increases, without filing a full-blown rate case.
Yeah. So the complexity changes dramatically when your pipeline crosses those sort of boundaries. So this is a bit of a question for all three of you. We heard these sort of arguments back during the coal severance days of the 1980s. Is that, well, these coal companies, they've already got their big mines here, their big invested fixed assets. They can't just pick these up and move them. The similar argument is made about property taxes, right? You got big refineries and some of these big investments that are in this state, and if you raise property taxes on them, they're not going to just pick up their stuff and move out of state. But there is kind of this next dollar sort of investment piece that comes here, and how that drives some of those discussions and some of the decisions. And I'll just throw it open to the three of you. Any one of you feel free to take a stab at it.
Well, I won't
Go ahead.
I won't speak to what these two, but I'll talk about the coal deal, and you're well aware of it, Todd, because you were in that industry for a long time. But Montana started out pretty competitive with Wyoming in the coal mining business till the severance taxes came along, and Montana was at 30% and Wyoming was at 15%, and then Montana went along a while and they dropped theirs to 15%, and Wyoming dropped theirs to 7.5%. But the whole result of that is Montana's coal industry never grew. It pretty much, what was there was there. They grew it a little in the 80s to make the case to lower the severance tax. The Wyoming industry grew, they built the infrastructure, and they basically captured most of the market because of that. And Montana's market was what you burned in coal strip and what little bit you could export. And so the tax system changed that whole investment and whole infrastructure relationship between the two states because of that.
Yeah, I think that's right, Bob. And what I think was interesting is that I think the philosophy of Wyoming at the time was that the value's not in the tax we receive. It's in the investment that comes in our state. It's the jobs that are created, right? And so that's what Wyoming was after. It's like, we want this investment in this state. And I think this is really applicable to this sort of argument and discussion we're having about property taxes.
Yeah, and I'd push back even a little bit on the idea that they won't pick up and move. I mean, we've seen in California some big, refineries, some big installations that were there have picked up and moved. You look at a lot of the tech sector in California has moved. And I don't think that is impossible here. I think there's a lot of companies that as those operating expenses go up, it's really a cost-benefit analysis of staying in Montana. If you have a lot of assets in a lot of different states, there's a possibility. You look at some of the, big industries that are struggling nationwide, something like movie theaters or some different things that didn't survive COVID as well. And those are jobs that are going to go away as a large national company looks and says, those assets in Montana are not producing the same way that they were 5 years ago, and our costs are so high. So I think it is possible that they'll pick up and leave. And to your next dollar point, you look at the investment portfolio of states like Wyoming, some of their decisions that they're making for that next investment. And Montana just isn't competitive again. I feel like a broken record, but partially because of that uncertainty and the high costs that we have.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point, Todd, on this issue. Economic growth is really driven by the marginal dollar. It's the next dollar. And I think while income tax is important, property tax is much more impactful to how capital gets allocated. So when capital flees a state or chooses another state because it's a more competitive environment, so go the jobs. So it's not just a matter of can they leave, it's the incremental development that you're going to lose plus the new. That's what you're at risk.
And Bob, as you and I, we've worked together quite a bit over the last few years, particularly on this sort of an issue here. And one of the things that I point to is how fast, or maybe not even fast, but how Montana's economy has evolved. And you think about how this was such a natural resource heavy dependent state not that many years ago. Where sawmills in rural communities, there was a lot more hard rock mining. There was a lot more oil and gas development. As those industries shrunk and to some extent even disappeared, the property taxes that they paid remain in the community. They're just paid by who's left in the community. And so as you kind of look ahead here and you see our economy evolving, what sort of kind of warning shots do we need to be considering as we see this economy continue to evolve?
Well, Todd, you hit on the first thing. Montana's property tax system was based on a 1900s, early 2000s economy where you had timber, manufacturing, mining. You had a big aluminum plant in Columbia Falls. I was listening to Brian Wood earlier talking about having to import aluminum. The whole Northwest used to have electric-fired aluminum smelters because they had all this excess electricity. And they lost all those, and that electricity is being used now by other things. Well, that's where Montana is. We don't have that type of industry. If we have industry, it's smaller, more specific types of industries. We're becoming more a service economy, tourism economy, and a high-tech economy. And a lot of high-tech isn't high property. They don't have a lot of investment in property and facilities and machinery. They have investment in people and a laptop computer and things like that aren't taxable. So, they don't generate a lot of tax revenue from the industry segment. You might get tax revenue from the people who work there, who maybe own a home or rent an apartment or something. But that's the change, is you really don't have those large taxpayers. I mean, we have a few of them left. We have a couple of mines, and we have the refineries and those types of things. But other than that, you're down to, even the big box stores are struggling because they're competing with internet sales. Small Main Street businesses almost extinct because of that. They can't stock the inventory that people want. You can have it delivered to your door in 2 days. That's the whole change in the economy, and our tax system doesn't recognize that yet.
Paul or Sarah, do you want to expand on that, or we got it covered? Good. So when you think about Montana's evolving economy, you think about what the benefits or the competitive advantage that some of our neighboring states have. North Dakota, you're an expert in North Dakota, Paul. And you think about what the opportunity is. I note that in 2016, no business leader was talking about a concern around energy, particularly electricity generation. It wasn't an issue. Today, they're all talking about it. There's this real concern that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be looking at electricity shortages, rolling blackouts, economic impacts. When you think about Montana and that we've got these natural resources, we've got the ability here, and then you look at a state like North Dakota, where you can see where there's like where the capital is likely to flow if we don't get this right.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think, you know, I didn't know if I was going to weave this in, but you kind of opened the door, Todd. So I'm not sure you're going to thank me for this later. But you know, at the end of the day, when we think about this competitive posture, we've got about 5 years to fix this business property tax issue with North Dakota. Once the next tranche of critical infrastructure gets built and that incremental Bakken gas gets sourced to downstream users, the critical mass that gets created there becomes significantly more challenging to compete against on price. So we've got about 5 years. So I hate to equate tax policy with planting trees or fixing tax policy with planting trees, but you know, we all know that the best time to have fixed this tax structure issue or planting a tree would have been 25 years ago. But having not done that, the best next option is to plant the tree today.
I'll just second that with other industries as well. I mean, if you're looking at the data center infrastructure, if we want to be competitive in that market, if we want to be competitive in a lot of the tech sector markets, or even some of the talk about biotech earlier, and then energy, of course. Right now, there are a lot of companies in a lot of different sectors who are poised to spend a lot of money, and they're looking at all of their different options. And they're going to take some feasibility studies. They're going to take some time to build that out. But there is an opportunity for Montana to be competitive there, or there is an opportunity for everybody to just pass and say, nope, this is easy. You know, Wyoming's another good example. Is Wyoming's being really competitive in the market in a bunch of different ways. They're doing some really interesting stuff with a vertical integration where they get a piece of every part of the data center, from the manufacturing of pieces all the way through up to the actual data center itself. And they're really thinking about that in sort of a long-term way that Montana just hasn't quite got there yet, and we need to.
So we don't want to end this completely on a negative note, right? This has kind of been depressing. So let's look for some of the like silver linings here, right? Like, because Montana has still got a lot going for it. This is an exciting state. There's a lot of opportunity here. We've seen the growth. We've seen the opportunity. We can hear the opportunities knocking on the door. Sarah, I'm going to start with you. Yeah. Why don't you rattle off some of the things that you think really kind of set us aside as far as like having a great opportunity for growth despite some of these challenges?
Yeah, we after our first discussion on this panel, we sort of ended with, oh dear, we better say, with all these people in the room, we don't want to say Montana's a terrible place. No, you should absolutely come here. It's like, there are some good things. And one of the things that's good is that the flip side of uncertainty is opportunity, right? So we have a legislature, elected officials, local government who really actually are very flexible, and they're very approachable, and they're very willing to move the needle on a lot of stuff. And so one of the examples, you know, we talk about the different class structures of the tax classes, is that shows how much the legislature can pivot at any given point in time. We did Class 17 last session. Now, that has created larger issues, but it also means that we do have some opportunity here to really engage in a meaningful way and move the needle a lot. I think the other side is all of the natural resources. You know, you look at right now, the price of copper, we all know, is going crazy, right? There's a lot of natural resource development that's available in Montana. And again, you have an opportunity here to really bring in some huge business because we can solve this issue and make it possible for them to come in and really give us some benefits to the local communities in terms of taxes, whether that be income or sales if we get there or whatever. And then You also have this tax appeal process, which I think in Montana, in a lot of states, people don't think about arguing about their taxes because it's a long process, it's very formal, it takes a lot of time and money. In Montana, that's not necessarily the case. And so you can actually just move the needle on your individual property with relatively little time and money, and even with relatively little long-term, it can give you long-term benefits in a relatively short amount of time. And so that's another positive that we have here, that the Department of Revenue will actually look at individual cases in a relatively short order and get you some adjustments.
So I've thought this for a really long time, and I really believe it. I'm going to levitate up to about 20,000 feet for my comments. But Montana sits really on the doorstep of prolific, ultra-competitive priced natural gas in the Bakken. And, we've got natural gas supply sitting there. We've got pipelines, we've got storage. So looking at the big picture, Montana has some advantages that other states would dream of being in the same position. The opportunities to leverage that gas for economic growth in Montana is real. We just need to figure out how to plant some trees.
I think Montana, as I said, has a lot of opportunity in its location and resources. We're a large state, got a lot of open space, got a lot of room to do things, and a lot of areas in Montana want that type of development. I mean, they need something to keep their economy going. Parts of Montana, it's hard to develop in because people are, I've got mine, shut the door. We don't want any more people here. We don't want any more development. And that's fine. They can survive there. So I think that's one of the opportunities is location, people. Montana exports a lot of really bright people. And a lot of them would come back if they could make a living here. They come back to retire, but it would be nice to have them back in their productive years also. So there's that opportunity. We have pretty good education systems. We have good university systems. Transportation isn't as big an issue for a lot of things as it used to be. Our location used to be a drawback because you had to transport everything in and you had to transport everything out. If you can build the infrastructure for information transfer, then you can do that anywhere. And I think that's the opportunity we have. I mean, Montana is working on that piece right now. So there's opportunity here, and some of it all isn't, the property tax is an issue. It's not the impediment to everything.
And Montana State University won the national championship last night, so.
I knew that was
Huh? There's a lot of good things going on in Montana. All right, let's open it up for questions. Any of you have any questions you want to ask? Brett Doney. Hang on a second, Brett.
I'm in Great Falls, and sometimes when I come down here, I think that we're in a different world up there. So natural gas, we don't have enough natural gas right now. We're telling companies we can't provide enough natural gas because we don't have the transmission capacity. And it is ironic because we're an energy state. And then on the property tax, you said short order. Our property tax appeals are taking 3 years.
Yeah.
So are we in a different world up there, or am I just not understanding things?
So I should clarify the relatively short order. I do litigation, so 3 years is like, yeah, that's it. No. But to the property taxes specifically, it's based on a little bit of what level you're working on, right? So if you go to just the county board level, that can happen I've seen it happen in 60 days. If you go up to the state appeal, you're talking more like a year. If you're going further, then you're, of course, going to have the same sort of litigation timelines that you're talking about. But I had a client, it took maybe 20 hours of my time and about 3 months. And we got their assessed value reduced by about $6 million. So for other states processing, I have colleagues who are in Denver and things like that, and it is a relatively accessible process at a lower level for if you're satisfied with sort of the first tier of it.
I think that if you can stay out of the court system, you're better off. Because the district courts in Montana are overloaded and overworked, and tax issues are the last thing they want to work on and the last thing they do work on. So you get in the court system, that slows you down. But if you can stay in the administrative appeal system, you can probably make some pretty good time. We were involved in a lawsuit in 2009 that went on for 6 years, never even had a day in court, and finally was declared moot.
And Brett, to your point about like you're turning away business investment because of a lack of natural gas, right? There's no transmission. And this gets to Paul Hopfoss' point about it's questionable whether you're going to see much of this sort of investment given this property tax structure that we have in Montana.
Yeah, so how it typically works is the transmission system is built based on the capacity people are willing to take. So our interstate system, it covers all the way across North Dakota. It goes as far west as Billings, and then it goes up along the High Line to about Malta. So we don't go all the way to Great Falls. Now, if there was sufficient, in theory, if there's sufficient demand that's willing to subscribe to firm capacity, that's how pipelines would get built on the interstate side.
Kerry.
So first, thank you all very much. That was a very good panel discussion, very good talk about property tax where we are. But Todd, I want to thank you for an editorial you wrote a couple months ago where you were a little bit subtle. So I'd like to hear from all four of you, what do you think about planting a tree that's called a sales tax?
I already ended my political future. Go ahead, Bob. You're next.
I'm going to be on the tour with the Bureau of Business and Economic Research this spring and this winter and talking about sales tax. So if you want to sign up to those, you can come and hear that spiel too. But one of my things I did was a history of what's happened in sales taxes. And when I first came to the legislature in the 90s and you had a sales tax bill, it was in the Supreme Court chamber and you had busloads of opponents and big hearings. When I got done, you'd have them in the smallest tax committee room in the building, and the chamber and the taxpayers would show up as proponents, and the two old retired union guys would show up as opponents, and then the bill would die. So we've always supported a sales tax because we think, first of all, it broadens the tax base, brings in people who aren't directly paying taxes, and so they have some ownership in government. And secondly, as I said, our economy's changed. You know, we don't have heavy industry much to tax anymore in a lot of places in Montana. All you have to tax is ag land and homes. And so, you know, you look at the tourism economy, Montanans are more transient within the state and things like that. There's a lot of opportunity there. It's surprising that there's still a lot of opposition to a general sales tax, but even in the legislature, there's a lot of support for local option sales taxes.
Ed, am I on? There we go. Ed, that's a great question. I think the sales tax would make Montana, the three-legged stool makes us more economically diverse, more stable, and it would make us more competitive across the board with the neighboring states. I think one of the things that gets missed in this property tax issue is all the school bonds across the state that fail, because that's the one thing people can say no to in their local jurisdiction. So we're thinking about workforce problems. We need to think about school investment. So that would help us on that front. So from my perspective, I'll put the first shovel in the dirt.
Go ahead, Kerry.
So you talk about the need for change. Is there an appetite in Montana for this change, whether it's the sales tax or whatnot? Do we think we just passed a big bill? Do you think there's an appetite at all to fix this next session?
Change is difficult difficult. So I don't know if right now there's an appetite for that particular change, but people want change. I mean, there's nobody happy with their property taxes. Even after the legislative work that was done and explained in the last session, most homeowners are somewhat happy because they got a fairly noticeable tax break, but most businesses aren't happy because their taxes went up. Next year, anybody that owns a second home is going to be extremely unhappy because the taxes on those second homes are going to double or go up 2.5 times. And so, you know, there's that whole issue. And there's initiatives or proposals out there to do it like California Prop 13 type freeze. You know, if that gets on the ballot, people will probably buy into that. So there's appetite for change. It's just not, when you do populist change, it's generally not the best change.
Yeah, and the Montana Chamber, we've been spending a lot of time and energy on polling this issue to find out, you know, is there an appetite? I mean, Montana's demographics have changed, our politics have changed, our industries have changed. How have our views around taxes and sales taxes changed? And so we've done quite a bit of work, and we are seeing movement where people are getting to the point where it's like, I can't stomach this anymore, and I'm much more open to an alternative tax. Interestingly enough, I think the state of Montana's population grew by something like 50,000 individuals between 2021 and 2024, 25. Those 50,000 people that moved into Montana largely came from sales tax states. And so I think there's this evolution that's taking place. I have zero confidence there'll be that kind of appetite to tackle something like this in the next legislative session. In fact, I think it's such a big issue, I think we don't dare. I think that as a state, I think we need to go about this in a very intentional, very thoughtful, very deliberative manner to peel this issue apart as a possible solution for our property tax issue.
Todd, I think we may have answered the question.
Great. Well,
So the question is, what about the trade? Property tax relief or sales tax?
Bob, you know the most about this.
Sure, it depends again on the structure of the sales tax and how much you want to raise. You know, I mean, the broader the base, the more money you can raise, the more property tax relief you can do. So it gets into how much services you're going to tax and that type of thing. So you're not going to get a sales tax without significant property tax relief, and you might not get one. I mean, there's proposals out there to completely eliminate the property tax. With that, you need a very broad-based sales tax, and then you create a whole nother problem of property taxes all fund local services, sales taxes collected at the state level, and how do you distribute that money back out to keep operations that actually provide services to people when most of that revenue is collected in 7 large cities and got to be distributed all over the state. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Last quick question.
Okay, outside of sales taxes, what other options are we talking about?
I think we're all going to look at Bob's story again.
Well, there's talk, and to do property tax relief, there was issues brought up, or ideas brought up last session. One was to take some income tax money, or not income tax money, but bed tax money, a lot of the taxes and types of taxes tourists pay in Montana. Instead of putting that in the state general fund, put that into a distribution system that would basically send money out to the counties, and then they would reduce property taxes on owner-occupied residences, kind of like the resort communities do with their resort sales taxes. That didn't get very far in the session. It's actually part of a omnibus bill that passed that created the Go Trust that it's got that same concept in it. That's one of the concepts. There's other concepts that says, well, let's just reduce spending and you know, cut the spending and don't need so much money. But again, all this property tax money is local schools and cities and counties. You know, it's pretty tough to say we're going to cut services at that level. But if the state wants to reduce spending and use some of its revenue stream to flow back downhill to offset property taxes through the school funding system or some revenue sharing with local governments, those are options that are being considered also.
Thank you, Paul, Bob, Sarah.
Well, thank you for taking the time to digest and dive into these complicated issues facing our state and our business environment. There's clearly more to do.